Bring me the real architect. Victor Hale's voice cut through the boardroom like a blade. The billionaire dropped the blueprint onto the glass table, the paper sliding across polished marble until it stopped in front of the executives. No one moved. 20 people sat around the long conference table, lawyers, investors, engineers. All of them suddenly very quiet. Victor tapped the blueprint once with his finger. This design, he said slowly, is too brilliant to come from the people listed on this project. A nervous laugh escaped from someone near the end of the table. Victor didn't smile. Who actually designed it? The project manager shifted in his chair. Sir, the file came from internal maintenance. A few executives chuckled. One of them muttered under his breath. A janitor probably submitted it by mistake. Victor's eyes turned cold. Then go find the person who made it. He leaned back in his chair. And bring me the real architect. Outside the glass doors of the boardroom, a woman holding a mop had just heard every word. Outside the boardroom, the hallway lights hummed softly above polished marble floors. Naomi Carter stood very still. The mop handle rested lightly in her hand, but she wasn't cleaning anymore. Through the tall glass wall of the conference room, she could see the silhouettes of executives leaning over the blueprints spread across the table. 20 people in tailored suits. Lawyers, engineers, investors, people who made decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And right now, every one of them was staring at the drawing she knew by heart. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. She hadn't meant for this to happen. 3 weeks earlier, it had been just another quiet night shift. The building emptied around 9 p.m., the elevators going silent one by one as the executives left for their penthouses and private drivers. By 10, the entire floor belonged to the cleaning crew. Vacuum machines hummed. Trash bags rustled. And Naomi moved quietly from office to office with her cart, the same way she had done for the past 2 years. Invisible. Most employees barely looked at her. To them she was just the janitor from night maintenance. The woman who wiped coffee stains off desks and polished the glass walls of rooms she was never meant to sit inside. But Naomi had always noticed things. Details. Numbers. Structures. That night, she had been wiping down the whiteboard in the engineering department when she saw the blueprints spread across a table. Large sheets. Wind load calculations. Structural columns marked in red. The top corner read, Hale Development, West Tower Project. Naomi paused. At first she only glanced at it. Just curiosity. But then her eyes caught something that made her frown. The load distribution on the west support core. Something about the angle of the transfer beam felt wrong. She stepped closer. Slowly. Her cleaning cloth still in her hand. The numbers ran through her mind automatically, the way they used to years ago when calculations were part of her daily work. Wind shear. Load transfer. Structural stress. She felt the same tightening in her chest she used to feel on engineering sites. The quiet alarm that told her something wasn't right. Naomi studied the blueprint longer. Then she whispered under her breath. That beam won't hold. No one was there to hear her. The office lights were dim. Outside the windows, the city skyline shimmered in the dark. For a moment she hesitated. This wasn't her place. She was a janitor now. Not an engineer. Not an architect. Just the woman who cleaned up after everyone else went home. Naomi turned to walk away. But after 2 steps she stopped. Because once you've spent years designing structures, you don't forget how buildings fail. And she knew exactly what would happen if they built that tower the way the blueprint showed. She set the cleaning cloth down. Pulled a pencil from behind her ear. The steel fatigue would start to spread. Naomi exhaled slowly. That tower would crack, she murmured. Her fingers traced the lines on the blueprint. Old instincts came back faster than she expected. Angles. Load paths. Stress points. It had been years since she last stood over architectural plans like this, but the language of structures never really leaves you. A building either stands, or it doesn't. And right now, this one wouldn't. She straightened slightly, glancing toward the hallway. No footsteps. No voices. The engineering staff had gone home hours ago. Naomi looked back at the blueprint. Technically, she should walk away. This wasn't her project. Not her responsibility. But the idea of that tower rising into the skyline with a flaw hidden inside it bothered her more than she expected. She imagined the building years from now. Thousands of people working inside it. Elevators running. Glass windows reflecting the city lights. And deep in the bones of the structure, a mistake. Naomi shook her head. She couldn't leave it like that. Slowly, she picked up the pencil. Her hand moved carefully across the paper. First, she crossed out the existing beam angle. Then she redrew the transfer point 2 feet lower along the support column. A small change, but it shifted the entire load distribution. From there, she added a secondary reinforcement beam along the interior frame. 3 strokes. Then 5 more. Her movements grew faster now, confident. She wrote a quick set of recalculated load numbers beside the drawing. Wind pressure, structural tolerance, safety margin. When she finished, Naomi leaned back slightly. The design looked different now. Stronger. Balanced. She studied it one last time. The tower would hold. She placed the pencil down. For a second, she considered signing her name somewhere on the corner of the page. But she didn't. Instead, she simply stacked the corrected blueprint neatly with the others on the desk. By morning, the engineers would see it. Maybe they'd assume someone from the team fixed the problem overnight. That was fine. Naomi wiped her hands on the cloth hanging from her cleaning cart and quietly turned off the office lights. Within seconds, the room looked exactly the way it had before she entered. Blueprints on the table. Chairs pushed in. No trace she had ever been there. Just another invisible night in the life of the janitor. But 3 weeks later in the glass boardroom down the hall, 20 executives were staring at the design she had quietly repaired. 3 weeks passed. The corrected blueprint Naomi had quietly left on the engineering desk moved through the company like any other internal document. No announcement. No questions. Just another file uploaded into the project system. But eventually, it reached the one person whose opinion mattered most. Victor Hale. The billionaire developer sat at the head of the glass boardroom table, flipping slowly through the pages of the West Tower design. Outside the windows, the city stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. Inside the room, 20 executives waited for his approval. This skyscraper was the largest project Hale Development had launched in years. Nearly $900 million in investment. Months of engineering work. Multiple consulting firms. Dozens of revisions. Victor turned another page. Then suddenly, he stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned closer to the blueprint. At first, no one spoke. They all knew that look. Victor tapped the page with his finger. Once. Twice. This beam, he said slowly. The room grew quiet. The engineers leaned forward. Victor traced the lines of the structure across the paper. The wind load problem on the West Tower, he paused, is gone. A few people exchanged surprised glances. Because everyone in the room knew that issue. It had delayed the project for months. 3 different firms had tried to solve it. None of them could eliminate the structural stress without redesigning half the tower. But the blueprint on the table showed something different. A simple adjustment. A lower transfer point. An additional reinforcement beam along the core frame. Elegant. Efficient. Victor looked up from the drawing. Who redesigned this? The lead architect blinked in confusion. Sir, this should be the same structural draft we reviewed last month. Victor slid the blueprint across the table. No, he tapped the new beam alignment. This change wasn't in the original plans. The engineers leaned closer now. One of them whispered quietly. Wait. Another flipped quickly through his tablet. The room grew tense as realization spread. This revision had appeared inside the system weeks earlier. No one questioned it. Because it worked. The calculations were perfect. But now Victor was asking the one question no one had bothered to ask. Where did it come from? The project manager cleared his throat. Well, according to the file log, he hesitated. The revision didn't come from the architecture department. Victor looked at him calmly. Then who submitted it? The manager glanced down at the screen again. His voice lowered slightly. It came from internal maintenance access. A quiet laugh escaped from someone near the end of the table. A janitor uploaded a skyscraper design, someone muttered. But Victor didn't smile. His eyes stayed on the blueprint. Then he closed the folder slowly. Bring me the real architect. The room fell silent again. Because somewhere in the building, the person who had solved the project's biggest problem was probably pushing a cleaning cart down a hallway. The boardroom doors opened quietly. The project manager stepped inside first, followed by a building security guard. Behind them walked a woman in a gray maintenance uniform. Naomi Carter. Her cleaning cart waited outside in the hallway. She still held the mop handle in one hand as she stepped into the room. For a moment, no one spoke. 20 executives stared at her. Lawyers, engineers, investors in dark tailored suits. Men and women who had spent their careers inside rooms like this. And now a janitor was standing in the center of their meeting. Someone at the far end of the table whispered under their breath. This has to be a joke. Another executive leaned toward the architect beside him. That's the woman who cleans this floor at night. A few quiet chuckles spread around the table. Naomi heard them, but she didn't react. She had cleaned this boardroom many times before. Late at night, when the chairs were empty and the city lights reflected off the glass walls. But she had never stood here like this. Victor Hale remained seated at the head of the table. His eyes studied her carefully, not with amusement, with calculation. He slid the blueprint across the glass surface until it stopped in front of her. The paper made a soft sound against the table. "Ms., he said. "Carter," she replied quietly. "Naomi Carter." Victor nodded once. Then he tapped the blueprint. The exact section she had corrected weeks earlier. "The structural change on this beam." His voice stayed calm. "Did you draw it?" The room waited. Some executives leaned back in their chairs, already smiling as if the answer would be obvious. The lead architect folded his arms. A janitor solving a structural problem that had stalled the project for months? Impossible. Naomi looked down at the blueprint. Her own pencil lines stared back at her from the paper. The revised beam. The reinforcement. The recalculated load numbers she had written in the margin. For a second, she said nothing. Then she lifted her eyes. "Yes," she said. The laughter came instantly. Short. Dismissive. One investor shook his head. "This is ridiculous." But Victor Hale didn't laugh. In fact, he didn't move at all. His eyes stayed on Naomi, studying her, because the woman standing in front of him didn't look nervous. She didn't look like someone who had made a mistake. She looked like someone who understood exactly what was on that blueprint. Victor leaned forward slightly. Then he asked the question that changed the atmosphere in the room. "Explain it." For a moment, the boardroom still carried the echo of laughter. A few executives leaned back in their chairs, shaking their heads. One investor whispered to the man beside him. This meeting just turned into a circus. But Victor Hale didn't smile. He didn't even glance at the others. His attention stayed fixed on Naomi Carter, the janitor standing beside the conference table, holding a mop. Victor tapped the blueprint once. "Explain it," he repeated. Naomi stepped closer to the table. She set the mop gently against the wall behind her. The movement was small, but it changed something in the room. Because now her hands were free. She leaned over the blueprint. For a second, her fingers hovered above the paper, like a musician about to touch piano keys after years away. Then she pointed to the beam Victor had marked. "The problem isn't the beam itself," Naomi said calmly. "The problem is the load transfer." The room grew quieter. A few engineers straightened in their chairs. Naomi continued. "The wind pressure on the west tower pushes laterally across the frame. But the original design transfers that pressure too high along the support column." She traced the original beam angle with her finger. "That creates rotational stress along the core structure." Someone near the end of the table frowned. Another engineer leaned forward. Naomi picked up the pen lying beside the blueprint. She drew a quick line across the page. "If you lower the transfer point by 2 feet, her pen moved again. And add a reinforcement beam here." She tapped the interior frame. "The load redistributes into the central core instead of twisting the outer columns." No one laughed now, because the way she spoke wasn't guessing. It wasn't lucky. It was precise. Engineering language. Victor watched her without blinking. "Continue," he said. Naomi nodded once. "The wind shear force is highest along the west face of the tower during crosswinds," she explained. "The reinforcement beam absorbs the stress before it reaches the outer frame." She wrote a quick number in the margin. "Safety margin increases by 30%. One of the senior engineers grabbed his calculator. Another opened the structural model on his laptop. Keys clicked rapidly. Numbers flashed across the screen. The room slowly filled with a different kind of silence. Not disbelief. Calculation. Victor folded his arms, still watching Naomi. "Where did you learn structural engineering?" he asked. Naomi didn't answer right away. Instead, she finished writing the last calculation beside the beam. Then she set the pen down. Across the table, the lead engineer suddenly stopped typing. He looked up. His expression had changed. "Sir," he said quietly. Victor turned toward him. "Yes." The engineer swallowed once. Then he spoke the words no one in the room expected to hear. "The math works." The room froze again, because the janitor standing beside the table had just solved the exact structural problem that had stopped the project for months. The room stayed frozen after the engineer spoke. The math works. For a few seconds, no one moved. The senior structural engineer pushed his chair back slightly and leaned closer to the laptop screen in front of him. His fingers moved again, entering Naomi's adjustments into the structural model. Numbers recalculated. Load distribution diagrams shifted. Another engineer opened the wind simulation file. A third began scribbling quick calculations across a yellow legal pad. The quiet laughter from earlier was completely gone. Now the only sounds in the room were keyboard clicks and the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. Victor Hale watched everything. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He simply stood there beside the table, arms folded, observing the engineers as they worked through the math. Then the second engineer stopped typing. His eyes moved from the screen to Naomi. "Sir," he said slowly. Victor looked at him. "Yes." The engineer turned the laptop slightly so the others could see. The wind simulation stabilizes. A murmur passed through the room. Another engineer spoke up. The rotational stress drops below the failure threshold. The lead architect ran the numbers on his calculator again. Once. Then again. His voice sounded quieter this time. The safety margin increases by 32%. Silence followed. Not disbelief anymore. Recognition. Victor turned back to Naomi. His expression had changed. Earlier, he had looked at her like a puzzle. Now he looked at her like a professional. "You didn't guess that," he said calmly. Naomi shook her head. "No." Victor stepped closer to the table and tapped the blueprint again. This kind of structural correction isn't something someone learns from watching YouTube videos. A few people in the room shifted awkwardly in their seats. Victor continued. "You understood the wind load distribution immediately." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Which means you've worked with structures like this before." Naomi didn't answer right away. She looked down at the blueprint for a moment, at the lines she had drawn weeks earlier in the quiet engineering office. Then she lifted her eyes. "I used to," she said. Victor tilted his head slightly. "Used to what?" Naomi's voice stayed calm. "I used to design structures." Someone near the far end of the table whispered quietly. "Wait, what?" Victor didn't react to the whispers. He only asked one more question. "Where?" Naomi hesitated for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer. Because she hadn't spoken those words in years. Then she said it simply. "Chicago Structural Engineering Group." The name landed heavily in the room. Two of the engineers immediately recognized it. That firm had designed half the bridges along the Midwest river systems. One of the investors leaned forward in his chair. "That's a top-tier firm," he said. Victor studied Naomi carefully. Then he asked the question everyone else in the room was thinking. "If you worked there," his voice remained calm, but the meaning behind it was clear. "Why are you cleaning floors in my building?" The question hung in the air. "If you work there, why are you cleaning floors in my building?" Victor Hale's voice wasn't mocking, but it was direct. In the boardroom, 20 people watched Naomi Carter as if they were seeing her for the first time. Not as the night janitor, but as someone whose calculations had just solved a $900 million engineering problem. Naomi stood beside the conference table. Her maintenance uniform suddenly looked very out of place in the glass and steel room. For a moment, she didn't answer. Her eyes moved briefly across the blueprint. Then she spoke quietly. "My husband got sick." The room grew still again. "Cancer," she continued. "The aggressive kind." A few of the executives shifted in their chairs. Naomi kept her voice calm, the way people do when they've already told the story many times before. "I took time off from work to take care of him." She paused. "Then the treatments got expensive." Victor said nothing. Naomi continued. "We went through our savings first. Then the house. Then the retirement fund." The words came out evenly, without bitterness. Just facts. "Eventually I had to leave my job." The lead architect frowned slightly. "You couldn't return after that?" Naomi shook her head once. "When you disappear from engineering projects for 2 years, people stop calling." She looked briefly toward the windows where the city skyline stretched into the distance. "By the time my husband passed away, I just needed work." The room was completely silent now, because everyone in that room understood what that meant. Engineering firms hire based on recent projects, active portfolios, continuous work. A gap in experience can close doors quickly. Victor studied Naomi carefully. "You never try to go back?" Naomi gave a small shrug. "I sent applications. Dozens of them. And the responses? Most never replied." She allowed herself a faint, tired smile. Some companies told me I was overqualified for the positions they were willing to offer. A quiet, uncomfortable shift moved through the executives. Naomi continued. And eventually the bills still needed to be paid. So I took the first job available. Victor glanced briefly at the mop leaning against the wall behind her. Cleaning floors. Naomi nodded. It was steady work. For several seconds, no one spoke. The same room that had laughed only minutes earlier now felt completely different. Because the story wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. It was simple and painfully believable. Victor looked down at the blueprint again. At the elegant correction Naomi had drawn weeks earlier during a night shift. Then he looked back up at her. When you saw the flaw in the tower design, he asked quietly, why didn't you just ignore it? Naomi answered without hesitation. Because people will work in that building. Her eyes met his. And structures shouldn't fail. Just because the wrong person noticed the problem. For several seconds after Naomi finished speaking, no one in the boardroom said a word. The skyline outside the glass windows shimmered in the afternoon light, but inside the room the atmosphere had completely changed. Earlier, there had been laughter. Now there was only silence. Victor Hale stood beside the conference table, his eyes still on Naomi. Not studying her like a puzzle anymore. Studying her like an engineer. He slowly reached for the blueprint again and looked down at the section she had corrected. The lowered transfer beam. The reinforcement along the core frame. The precise load calculations written in the margin. Victor had spent 30 years in real estate development. He had seen hundreds of architectural plans, thousands of engineering reports, and he knew exactly how rare it was to see a solution this clean. He tapped the blueprint lightly. You solved a structural flaw that 3 consulting firms couldn't fix. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words filled the room. Across the table, the lead architect shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another engineer avoided Naomi's eyes. Victor continued. And you did it during a night cleaning shift. Naomi didn't respond. She simply stood beside the table, her posture steady. Victor glanced around the room. He could see the same realization spreading across the faces of the executives and investors. The woman they had laughed at minutes earlier was the only person who had actually solved the project's biggest engineering problem. Victor looked back at Naomi. Do you know what this project is worth? He asked. She shook her head slightly. Approximately $900 million. A quiet murmur moved across the table. Victor slid the blueprint toward her again. And the stability of the West Tower now depends on the change you made. He paused. Then he asked a different question. Not the kind executives usually ask janitors. Ms. Carter. His voice carried clearly across the room. If I handed you the full structural plans for this tower, could you finish designing the rest of it? Victor Hale's question hung in the air. If I handed you the full structural plans for this tower, could you finish designing the rest of it? The executives looked at Naomi immediately. Some with curiosity, some with disbelief, and a few with quiet concern. Because this was no longer a strange moment in a meeting. Victor Hale was asking a janitor if she could finish the structural design of a $900 million skyscraper. Naomi looked down at the blueprint again. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table. For a brief moment, the room waited for hesitation. After all, she hadn't worked in engineering for years. But Naomi didn't look uncertain. Instead, she studied the drawing like someone returning to a language she had spoken fluently her entire life. Her eyes moved across the beam structure, the load paths, the core support system. Then she lifted her head. Yes, she said. The answer came calmly. Not proud, not nervous, just certain. The boardroom reacted immediately. One investor leaned forward sharply. Victor, we can't seriously be considering this. Another executive spoke more cautiously. She may understand that correction, but finishing an entire tower design is different. The lead architect cleared his throat. With respect, sir, we already have 3 firms contracted for this project. Victor didn't look at any of them. His attention stayed on Naomi. Because he had watched her explain structural load distribution without notes. Watched her correct calculations in real time. Watched his own engineers confirm her math. Finally, Victor turned toward the table. You're all correct about one thing, he said. This is a $900 million project. The room grew quiet again. Victor placed his hand on the blueprint. And the only person in this room who has actually solved its biggest structural flaw. He looked back at Naomi. Is the woman you laughed at 5 minutes ago. The boardroom stayed silent after Victor Hale finished speaking. The woman you laughed at 5 minutes ago. The words settled heavily across the glass table. No one laughed now. The investors exchanged quiet looks. The lead architect leaned back slowly in his chair, folding his arms as he studied Naomi again, this time much more carefully. Because the situation had changed. A few minutes earlier, she had been the janitor standing awkwardly beside the table. Now she was the person who had corrected a structural failure no one else in the room had solved. Victor picked up the blueprint again. He turned the page slowly, studying the structural grid of the tower. Then he looked at Naomi. When you adjusted the transfer beam, he said calmly, you also strengthened the core frame. Naomi nodded slightly. Yes. Victor continued. That means you were already thinking about the rest of the building. Naomi answered simply. You can't fix one structural problem without thinking about the whole structure. A couple of the engineers quietly nodded. That was true. Structural systems were never isolated. Victor placed the blueprint down again. Then he did something that surprised everyone in the room. He walked around the conference table. Not toward the executives. Toward Naomi. 20 pairs of eyes followed him. Victor stopped a few steps in front of her. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he asked one final question. When was the last time you worked on a full structural design? Naomi thought for a moment. About 5 years ago. Victor studied her face. No hesitation. No attempt to exaggerate. Just a straightforward answer. The billionaire developer nodded once. No one argued. The room stayed quiet as Victor Hale's words settled over the table. For years, the people in that boardroom had trusted experience, credentials, and reputation. But the truth was sitting right in front of them. A blueprint. A structural solution none of them had found. And the woman who drew it. Victor turned fully toward Naomi Carter. Miss Carter, he said calmly. Are you willing to review the full structural plans for the West Tower? Naomi glanced down at the blueprint again. For a moment, the room disappeared. The glass walls, the investors, the expensive suits. All of it faded behind the lines on that paper. Because those lines were familiar. Columns, load paths, foundations. For years, she had designed structures just like this. Before hospitals, before bills, before life quietly pushed her out of the profession she loved. Naomi looked back up. Yes, she said softly. Victor nodded once. Then he turned toward the project manager. Cancel the additional consulting review. The manager blinked. Sir. Victor gestured toward the blueprint. We already have the engineer who solved the problem. He looked back at Naomi. Effective immediately, Ms. Carter will work with our structural team on the final tower design. A murmur spread through the room. Not protest this time. Recognition. Even the lead architect slowly nodded. Because the math didn't lie. Victor stepped closer and extended his hand. Welcome back to architecture, Ms. Carter. Naomi looked at his hand for a brief moment. Then she shook it. Her grip was steady. Across the table, one of the investors quietly pushed the blueprint toward her. Not as a test, but as an invitation. Outside the windows, the skyline stretched across the horizon. Steel towers, glass structures, buildings designed by people who had once stood exactly where Naomi stood now. Victor glanced at the mop still leaning against the wall. Then back at her. You can leave that there, he said. Naomi looked at the cleaning handle for a moment. Then she turned away from it and walked toward the seat at the conference table. The same seat she had polished dozens of nights before, when no one noticed she was there. Now every chair in the room was watching. Because sometimes the person who understands the structure best is the one who has quietly supported everything all along. And on that afternoon, in a glass boardroom high above the city, the janitor who fixed the tower finally took her place as the architect who would build it.